Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for our workshop on pre-registration, a practical guide. My name is Mark Adkins. I'm at York University in the quantitative methods area, and this is part of our quantitative methods spring workshop series. So a little bit about me. I'm a fourth-year doctoral student candidate in the quantitative methods program within the psychology department at York University, Toronto, Canada. And if you're curious a little bit more about me, you can go to my webpage, standarddeviator.com, where I've got a lot of my different projects and things listed there, as well as the slides. So if you wanted to follow along with these slides, you can just go to standarddeviator.com, and there'll be probably in the main page a link to the slides, because throughout the slides, there'll be a lot of little hyperlinks like this, so you can actually click through and go to the resources and things I'm pointing to. So if you ever want to find something I talked about, you can just load up the slides and just click the link, and it'll open up into a new tab in your browser, and away you go. So I'd like to know a little bit more about you guys who are attending here. So all the people who registered, I took a little bit of information about where the institutions they're from, and this is the people who are supposed to be here. And not quite as many people showed up here, but we got quite a bit of number of people from York here, as well as across a bit of the Eastern United States, as well as a few that were maybe going to be connecting from abroad. So you're also going to be my guinea pigs. I've never done a Zoom poll before, but I've got one quick question. I'm just going to put this up and see if this works for what I'm expecting. So it's just one quick question. You can see how this goes. Okay. So there's our results here. So everybody who showed up, you heard that pre-registration was a useful tool. So I'm sure you've heard around that it might be something you should probably be doing, or maybe think about doing for some of your research. If it's free, it's always a good incentive for most people. I really like the idea of horizontal transmission of knowledge. As a grad student myself, things that I learned, I can also share with you guys. So I find that to be pretty helpful. And just for specific questions about pre-registration, I built in some time at the end of the workshop. So if you've got some questions specifically about something you're working on, you're thinking about pre-registering, we'll probably turn off the recording for those if you want, and we can just go ahead and try and do what we can for answering those. Okay, so I'm going to assume that I'm not sure how much knowledge you guys have in the background as far as like the open science community, but something you might have been familiar with or come across is the Center for Open Science, which is a fantastic organization that has a lot of different initiatives that are pretty helpful, and also showcase the slides. I'm just going to hop over to the website for a second. And so this is their sort of homepage, and the Center for Open Science is about having research software tools, community action, and cultural change. They look into meta science and research. And they have a lot of great initiatives and a lot of great resources on their websites. But that's just an example of how you can click through the slides and go to something I'm talking about. So while I'm demonstrating or talking about something and you're curious about something I mentioned, you can scroll back to the slides and hop around and look. And one of the initiatives like this open science framework, which is what we're going to be using a lot, and I got a lot of resources from there because they've got helpful blogs, a lot of different guides and examples for you as far as resources for pre-registering or to sort of try to improve your transparency of your research. So they got a list of helpful guides, as well as you can go to the main page if you're curious about. But we're going to be dealing with the Open Science Framework, or OSF, as it's commonly referred to, quite a bit. So around here. Okay, another thing I would recommend for most people is creating what's called an open researcher and contributor ID. So if you haven't heard of ORCID before, I highly recommend it. So I've two publications I've gotten so far, both journals actually required me to have an ORCID ID. And straight from their website, some of the benefits is that you'll be distinguished from every other researcher. So even researchers who share the same name as you, they'll be completely disambiguate you. Research outputs and activities will be correctly attributed to you. Contributions and affiliations will be reliably and easily connected to you. You'll enjoy improved discoverability and recognition because someone can go up to your profile and see a list of all of your works in one common place. Another thing is the ORCID record is yours forever for free, which is pretty nice. And when you're signing up for these, what I recommend my personal preference will be to use some sort of stable personal email you have, not necessarily an institutional one. Because especially as grad students, you don't know where you're going to end up. You could be doing a doctorate degree at a different institution. You could get a postdoc somewhere, and then you're going to have a different email address tied to that institution. And your org is going to be something that follows you around for your career, gathering all of your information. So having a reliable sign that's going to be stable over your career and not just simply the institution you're at is one thing I would recommend. And again, you can go to this link here if you want to do those things. Another thing I like about having ORCID is I use that for signing into the OSF, the Open Science Framework. So I'm creating repositories and pre-registrations, which we'll actually demonstrate live later on in this workshop. I use that for my sign-in, and it sort of makes sure that everything is synced across my different projects. It's quite handy. So when we're talking about pre-registration, it's really important to actually sit down and define what you mean, because depending on who you talk to, people might have different views or conceptions of exactly what is or isn't in a pre-registration. So according to the Center for Open Science, you're simply specifying your research plan in advance of your study and submitting it to a registry. That's sort of like a plain bare bones pre-registration. All you need is just the research plan in advance of your study, very key things, and then putting into some sort of registry. The Nosek and colleagues had another paper talking about a pre-registration revolution, where they defined pre-registration of analysis plan as committing to analytic steps without advanced knowledge of the research outcome. So it's not just about your research design anymore, it's also about how you're going to be analyzing your data. And as a methodologist in training, I've done many statistical consulting appointments where people come in, they've carefully identified their research question, their hypotheses, how they're collecting the data, and they've got their data and they have no idea how they're about to analyze those. And to me, it's not too much more of a step to sort of plan those things in advance, because if you know enough about the structure or design of your study, you should have at least some sense of the analysis you're proposing to plan. And if you're not sure, highly recommend you talking to someone before you collect the data, because it can really help with a lot of foreseeable problems as far as the data collection and analysis procedures go. There's also a really good blog by Danielle Navarro, which this is actually a link to a preprint, because the blog itself garnered a lot of attention. And so she wanted to make sure that it's in a stable location on as a preprint on an archive. So if her blog ever changes, that'll always remain the same. So you can actually look. And some people are actually not in principle, but they're a little hesitant about pre-registration, because a lot of people boast these really grand claims about what pre-registration can do for you, and not all of them necessarily follow by the definition of pre-registration. But with our current definition, we're going to follow with some of Danielle's version, where some of the key things that should be present for any pre-registration is that it should relate to a specific study, not a class of studies. So if you're in your lab who commonly does a particular paradigm for your experiments or observational studies you're doing, your pre-registration is for a single one, or if you have a set of them, your pre-registration should exactly elaborate on the sequence of studies you're going to be doing. So it's not just for a class of studies, it is for one specific research output that you're working on. And ideally, pre-registration should be public and findable or accessible by anyone, because that's where one of the benefits and strengths of these are, is that people can actually see what others are pre-registering or studying, see if anyone else has looked at a particular problem before. When you are creating pre-registrations with OSF, you have the option of putting like an embargo period or create them as private, so that they're there, you've got them, they're timestamped, everything's where it's supposed to be doing, but they're not necessarily publicly searchable yet. And you can decide to either make it publicly available immediately or after a certain period of time. And authors should state your data collection and analysis plans prior. So I'm a strong advocate for, if you've taken the time to carefully articulate your research question and developed your measures or the scales you're going to be using, you should know how you're going to be analyzing those prior to even collecting the data. So what pre-registration is not. So when I was first stepping into the open science community, I got a couple of things easily confused, because a lot of things start with the prefix of pre, and I mixed them all up. So for clarity, preprint would be a manuscript that's posted on a public repository, which probably hasn't necessarily been peer-reviewed, although there are options for having comments, and you get feedbacks and do revisions on them. And one within psychology is SciArchive. And you got a link to that right there if you want to look. You can actually browse around to different preprints to see what people are doing. It's a really, really handy thing. And actually, there's a lot of really great material there. And just because it hasn't been peer reviewed doesn't necessarily mean this without merit. There's actually quite a lot of good stuff there, because sometimes a peer review process, it's not exactly clear what they're contributing above and beyond the original research. So registered reports are a really interesting publication format. It's similar in spirit to the pre-registration, but I think it was like the really cool older brother of pre-registrations, where for the typical research process would be you develop your idea, design your study, collect, analyze data, so on and so forth, all the way down to hopefully publication. That's what a lot of us are trying to aim for. And where the pre-registrations fall in is sort of you've developed your idea, you've designed your study, maybe you've also proposed analysis of how you're going to analyze the data. And that happens right here before you've collected or even seen a single subject or participant. And then you go on with writing and trying to submit for publication. Registered report is a lot better in the sense that once you've developed your idea and you've designed your study and you've got your analysis plan, so everything is set before you collect the data, you can actually go to find different journals, and I believe through this link right here, you can actually check which journals actually offer the registered report format. And so what you're doing is you're sort of submitting to the journal saying, here's what I'm planning to do, here's all the stuff about the design of my study, how I'm going to analyze it, and then they can get an in-principle acceptance where they're agreeing to publish your study regardless of the results. It doesn't matter if you've obtained statistical significance or if you're in a Bayesian framework, people don't like your priors you've chosen or whatever it is, they're agreed that you're going to publish it provided you fall and keep in compliance with your plan. And so then you can go ahead, collect your data, analyze it, write it, and you'll have some back and forth with stage 2, but then you get it published. So pre-registration, everything is similar up to here, and then the registered report saying, okay, they might ask for a couple more specific details that you might not have thought about to include in pre-registration. And once you've done all that work up front, you can submit it to journals for publication and sort of get that in-press or in publication sort of process on there where you can, again, proceed later on to actually get it published. A little bit easier, a little bit more work up front, but really good format I recommend. So if you haven't seen these around, some people like them, some people don't, but these OSF Open Science badges. So the ones we care about specifically here today are the ones for pre-registered research. I believe APS over in the United States puts these on some of those. I frequently get emails and they've got the title of the author's work and they've got these little badges beside there indicating whether they've got openly available data, whether they've pre-registered the research, or whether their materials are also openly available. And all that's required for getting these badges attached to your work would be a public date time-stamped registration in an institutional registration system like OSF, or there are others like clinicaltrials.gov, and we're going to be focusing on the OSF version today. Make sure that your pre-registration actually predates the intervention. So again, you've actually registered what you're going to do before you go to do it. That's clearly important. And that your registered design corresponds directly to your reported design. So how you designed your study, the final work that you submit for publication, and if it gets published and they attach one of these badges to it, and these are sort of, probably not sort of, it needs to fall in line with your design of your study. You also make sure you have full disclosure of results in accordance with your registered plan. So if you had a particular research question, you want to look at a relationship between a couple different variables, regardless of the statistical significance or whether the outcome was sort of in line with what you were expecting, you still have to report on those. So if you said you're going to do an analysis, you have to make sure you follow through and actually report everything from those analysis, regardless of whether they're in line with your research question or not. They've got the slightly more advanced version, which is the pre-registered plus. The plus stands for plus analyses. So they're going to be the same criteria, except for the third one, where it says that you all have to make sure that your design and analysis plan completely correspond with what you reported you're going to do. So as a reminder, if you're going to be going through all the effort of pre-registering your research, going through the design, carefully articulating your research question and hypotheses, you also probably want to think about, you want to think about your analysis plan and how you're going to be modeling your data. And when you're doing that, if you're looking at the badge system, think about aiming for this one where you're doing your design and your analysis. If you want to find out more, there's a handy little link there to the OSF. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me as I'm going. You can use the raise hand feature, you can type in chat, or you can politely interrupt while using your microphone. is much better off for everybody if it's a little bit more interactive. So if you want a little bit more information about one of these sources or a question specifically you might be interested in, feel free to please interrupt and stop me, and we can sort of discuss those. We've got the time built in for that. Okay. I'm not sure if you've also been encountered the transparency, openness, promotion guidelines, or the top guidelines by the Center for Open Science. So these guidelines were created by journals, funders, and societies to help align scientific ideals with their practices. And why I'm bringing these up here is part of the transparency, openness, promotion guidelines, or top guidelines, is journals have explicit statements about where they stand on some of these openness principles, like something like pre-registration. And the OSF actually maintains a handy database, which we're going to hop to in a moment, which actually ranks journal policies in terms of their compliance with these guidelines. So if you are thinking about doing a particular research, if you're as a grad student, you may have talked to the supervisor about maybe target journals you're aiming for in your field, other flagship journals, or ones that are more suited to maybe the type of research product you're looking to develop. You might actually look and see whether that journal actually requires a pre-registration, because some of them do. And so you can think about in advance of what are they looking for, so you can start tailoring your work to that. So I'm going to hop into that now. So this is again just at the on OSF. It's just loading up and over here. So these are the top standards, the different modules or the criteria upon which different journals are based. So you can look at data citation, you can look at whether the study pre-registration is sort of required. And if I remember correctly, these rankings go from 0, 1, 2, or 3. So 0 means there's no mention. So for data citation, for behavioral development from one of the APA journals, there's 0 mention of data set citation. So you don't have to worry about any of those things. But let's just say we wanted to be interested in, it's a little bit slow. Okay, as it slowly catches up to the things I'm clicking on and double clicking. Okay. I'm going to pretend that I did just the analysis plan or the study pre-registration like we're interested in. And you can actually sort alphabetically by journals. You can also scroll to the study pre-registration. And so I can sort. So for instance, the Journal of Politics and the British Medical Journal of Open Science, these all have 3, which means they actually formally require that you pre-register your study in advance of actually conducting it, if it's appropriate. There are times where there are different extenuating circumstances. But again, if the idea is if you know a particular journal you're interested in and you want to know where their policy is a nice way of sort of summarizing that information. So if you see 3s, if required. If it's 2, then they're going to be strongly encouraged, so you should go for those, do it anyways. So let's just handle a little resource if you want. You can also sort by different publishers and disciplines if you're not sure about which journals are doing which. It's a pretty handy little chart. Back and forth a little bit. Okay, there we go. Okay, so yes, again, that database is used to help you target different journals based on whether they require pre-registration or any of these other open science principles. So what can pre-registrations actually do for you? That's again up to debate. Some people think it does certain things. So my answer is it depends. As a methodologist or statistician, it always is depends is the easy go-to answer, because it truly does. It's sort of contingent on what your purpose is. What are your goals? So if you just heard that pre-registration is something you should be doing, that's not a very strong argument for those, because you want to know, okay, are there certain goals that can be achieved by doing pre-registration that maybe can't be achieved using other tools? You want to make sure that why you're doing something is sort of forefront in your mind when you're designing your pre-registration, because that'll help guide the questions that or how you answer some of these questions as you proceed. So it does depend on your purpose. So pre-registration can improve the transparency of your research. I will say that there are some really excellent pre-registrations and there are some less than excellent pre-registrations, where by reading them, I'm not entirely sure what their purpose was, because they didn't really specify enough for me even to understand the design of their project. They just said they did a pre-registration, they answered maybe a couple of questions, and that's it. And that doesn't help me assess, or it doesn't make their research very transparent. So if that was their goal, I would be comfortable saying they didn't quite achieve that. So one nice takeaway is when you do your pre-registrations, you're never going to get it all right the first time or include everything. I did a pre-registration last year. I'm going to show you. And as I'm looking at this, I sort of cringe a little bit because as I've learned more over this past year, there's a couple things I would have done differently. And that's okay. That's part of the learning process. So you're going to be trying to do your first pre-registration. And then the goal is that your next pre-registration is going to be a little bit better because you're a little bit more aware of maybe some of the questions you should be asking. Pre-registration could, if you design it right, reduce researcher degrees of freedom. So if you're not familiar with the term researcher degrees of freedom, that's sort of a reference to the idea that in the design of your study and the analysis of the study, there's a lot of different ways you could have gone. So you can think of it as there's I think Edward Gelman has this term called the garden of forking paths, where at any point you could have made a couple different decisions. Like, what if you decided to use a different scale for depression instead of the scale you chose? Would the respondents have answered differently, and would you have gotten different results from your study just because of the scale or how you operationalized your variables? What if you changed or added some exclusion criteria to your analysis as you've been proceeding along with the analysis? And the problem with that is now maybe you're going to be obtaining statistical significance because those outliers or significant cases might be pulling your results in one particular direction that you might not be interested in. So there's a lot of things you can be doing consciously or even accidentally without meaning to, is take advantage of these researcher degrees of freedom and artificially inflate the false positive rate or the odds. If you're in a no hypothesis statistical testing framework, you might be finding more statistically significant with the false positive, yeah. So again, you're, let's say the type 1 errors, you're artificially inflating that. So you're going to be more likely to obtain significance because you can make choices about your analysis plan that make it more likely to find those things. And ideally, if your goal with your pre-registration is to improve the transparency of your research, and you also want to reduce researcher degrees of freedom, then you need to start thinking about what are these different decisions that you want to sort of lock in with your pre-registration plan for the design of your study and for the analysis. They can sort of make these decisions in advance as best as you can to sort of prevent that sort of accidental happening, or worse yet, intentional abuse of researcher degrees of freedom. Some people have read around on the internet, there's a blog on the OSF, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but I wanted to include it here as well because the idea that there are different opinions where that a pre-registration can reduce the file drawer effect. So the file drawer effect, if you're not familiar, is the idea that there's a lot of published work out there. So a lot of scientists, grad students, researchers are producing vast amounts of information and scholarly work, even if we're sitting here on a weekend or holiday weekend in Canada. Not everything makes it to the publishers and gets published. So you might have a lot of unpublished work. And so there's this, actually we'll tie this to the next point about a publication bias where only the novel findings or the things that obtained statistical significance, those are the ones that make it to be published. All the other work gets sort of like pushed by the wayside or stuck into a file drawer, and it's never going to see the light of day again. So nobody knows that you looked into a particular effect, maybe within a certain research paradigm, and you failed to find statistical significance. Like, you looked and you couldn't find evidence of the effect you were interested in anywhere. That's actually an important contribution to science. Like, people should know all these failed attempts as well, though it doesn't look like it's a very strong and robust effect because everybody finds it. That's just what makes it into the literature with the publication bias. So at least with pre-registrations, you could make the argument that if you're filling it all out saying, here's the study that you're going to conduct, and then you go ahead and make that publicly available, it's now findable. So someone could actually see that you at least proposed to go do that research. A better option yet is if you try to get it published and it's not, no journals are accepting it, you can also publish it as a preprint. So that means you have a pre-registration prior to collecting your data. You've analyzed it, you've written up your manuscript, and you can't seem to get it published. You can also post it as a preprint. So now people can actually find that and see what you did, and they can be used for things like meta-analyses and things judicially. Not every preprint is always necessarily a great quality, but they are a really, really useful resource. And so same with publication bias, but perhaps a better way of combating publication bias would be one of these registered report formats, where a journal has an in-principle acceptance where they agree to publish your work, regardless of the outcomes of your research. So whether they're a statistical significant finding, if that's what you're after or not, they agree to publish it. So it's not just all positive results that are being seen across the literature. You can also maybe have pre-registration help reduce unintentional false positives or inflation results. So that's tied very closely to reducing your researcher degrees of freedom. So there's lots of things you can do, again, intentionally and even very unintentionally. You just don't realize that you're doing these things. And if you're curious, there's a nice little paper talk a little bit more about that by Forstmeyer, Wagenbachers, and Parker. One thing I do agree on is that pre-registrations can be a tool to help clarify your thinking. It's not the only tool that can do that. So even something not as simple, but a lab notebook. So as you're going through your analysis, when you encounter problems, when you are thinking about how you're analyzing your data, keeping good, careful documentation of those things is great, helpful tool for clarifying your thinking. So you might encounter questions you didn't think about in advance. So it'd be good to stop and think, how should you approach this problem if it does arise? Because there are things in data analysis that frequently come up, like missing data. How are you going to deal with that? You can have some plan in advance that says, if I've got missing data, I'm going to follow such and such of a recommendation to sort of help deal with it, or at least mitigate some of the problems missing data can introduce into your research. So anything that makes you stop and think is going to be a good thing for your research, and pre-registration is, I strongly believe, a tool that can help with that. Another really important thing pre-registration can do is delineate what's called prediction from post-diction, or exploratory versus confirmatory analyses. So again, since your pre-registration is done in advance of, ideally in advance of you seeing the data ever, or actually conducting an analysis, if you're trying to run a confirmatory analysis or make predictions about things, obviously you have to predict those in advance of actually seeing the data. Otherwise, I don't really have much stock or credibility in that you actually predicted those things. It's possible, but again, a pre-registration, you make it very clear that you said 3 months ago in the timestamped document that you are not even allowed to edit yourself. It's just they're locked in time. You said you're going to do that thing. And so it's very common in research, in psychological research, that you might mistake post-diction as prediction, because doing that would also underestimate the uncertainty of your outcomes and can produce psychological overconfidence in the results of your findings. So I really like the analogy of in pool. So if you're not familiar, I'm not going to explain that, never mind. But it's like doing a called shot in pool. So what's more impressive, that someone told you they're going to bank the cue ball twice off of 2 sides and they hit a particular ball into a particular pocket, like a very precise prediction, and they go ahead and do that? But it gives me a lot of credibility that they didn't just accidentally get it into the spot. It's like the same thing as like saying, what if you also took the cue ball in the same pool example and you hit it really hard and the balls went everywhere and one of them bounced 3 times, then went into a corner pocket, and afterwards you're like, yep, that's exactly what I planned on doing. And I'm like, no, there's no way I believe you did that on purpose, where you haphazardly just hit them and you accidentally got something or discovered a finding. I want to know in advance that that's what you're planning on, or at least you had a good shot at getting that in. So putting in a pre-registration or a prediction in advance is kind of like the called shot and pool. It's a lot more credible. I have a lot more belief in the skill or the expertise of the researcher, to take the analogy back to us. When you can predict something in advance with a very specific and narrow window of success, saying this is exactly what I think I'm going to find. And if you find that and you've called it or predicted it in advance, that's a lot of credibility to your work. Okay. So what pre-registrations cannot do for you is, by definition, they can't just improve your research simply through the act of pre-registering. So the fact that you sat down and wrote a pre-registration isn't going to improve the quality of your work. The fact that you sat down and thought carefully about a lot of maybe really hard or difficult questions about your research design or analysis plan, that's where the quality comes in. The fact that you wrote it down in a timestamp document, that's helpful for other reasons, but just by pre-registering isn't going to be improving your quality of your research. It's the fact that you stopped and thought carefully and thoroughly all the way through that. So again, that's not what something pre-registration can do. Pre-registration can't just increase the transparency of your research. However, I will say that a good pre-registration could do that. So again, I've seen some less than helpful pre-registrations out there where someone wrote up something, they maybe wrote out their vaguely defined research question, but they didn't maybe have a formal hypothesis written down, or they didn't talk about the design of the study or how they're going to analyze their data or any of these other really important features. And like, it doesn't really add any transparency whatsoever. However, if you take the time to do it carefully, then yeah, a good pre-registration could do those, but just pre-registering by itself isn't going to do the trick. So another thing pre-registration cannot do, just purely for the act of completing the document, is prevent p-hacking or other what's called questionable research practices, or QRPs. Again, a pre-registration or a good one could do some of those things. So if you're not familiar with the term p-hacking, the idea with p-hacking is it is a intentional or unintentional way of artificially inflating or trying to make the results or outcomes of your study more in line with what you're expecting or hoping to find. So if you're hoping to find evidence for an effect, there's a lot of things you could do along the way about tweaking the design, maybe omitting a subgroup or analyzing a specific subgroup comparisons within your study design, or analyzing your data a certain way, or removing a bunch of outliers because they are sort of pulling the or obscuring the effect you're going to justify it. Those are all good rational decisions to make about how you might want to do those parts or break up your analysis. But it really opens up the realm of p-hacking and trying to obtain statistical significance in favor of what you're hoping to find, just because of how you're making those decisions. So it doesn't stop those, but it can help mitigate those if you, again, take the time carefully to reduce those researcher degrees of freedom, and that can prevent p-hacking from being a problem. And when I say questionable research practices, it's just the idea that you're not saying or even implying that someone is deliberately fabricating part of their work or falsifying it or trying to deliberately do these things. When we say questionable, that's like the polite language of saying, I can't tell. So when I look at the research, it looks like you could have p-hacked. It's like, I'm skeptical. I think they raised hand in just a moment. I'm skeptical that you were able to decide that this particular subgroup analysis is meaningful that you want to talk about when you didn't sort of specify that in advance. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Dr. Mark. My question is regarding the prevent p-hacking and other questionable research practices is, in the case of Diedrich Staple, which is the infamous fraud, and I was wondering if he was to do a pre-registration and kind of, haphazardly did one just to prevent suspicion, would he be able to say like, oh, I did it, so you can't criminalize my findings? Well, something he did is above and beyond illegal, so I don't know how that would implicate pre-registration wise.
Well, that's a very good question. So that's another instance where pre-registration isn't going to prevent those things, because if someone is, we'll say, nefarious motives, I don't know how else to put it, or for personal gain or notoriety or whatever the reasons are, you might even be the extreme case of fabricating data, a very beyond, it's like not just a questionable research practice, that's an unethical research practice. And someone could try to hide those things by trying to do pre-registration. So if you're trying to fabricate your data and you've already made it up to look a certain way, and you sit down, do your pre-registration, it's not going to stop that. Because again, you could do all these things. So if you know exactly how you're going to tweak the data, you can write a pre-registration, say, here's what you're looking for, and then maybe after that, go back and make up all the data you want to sort of support, go in line with the analysis you're going to be doing. A pre-registration won't detect those things. So it's a very good question. As far as the Diedrich Stoppel case, yeah, this wouldn't be the tool that would have helped maybe catch him, because again, if he has all of his collaborators and no one's really aware of those things, if someone was trying to dig around and check, or you suspected something, like someone was doing these things, looking to see if they've got a pre-registration might be one place to look. Say, okay, so they planned all these things back in advance, and maybe it's really quirky if he had made a mistake and they pre-registered 4 different things all on the same day, but okay, maybe you had some idea of coordinating all these things. But again, any one of these things isn't going to be enough. And pre-registration, I don't think necessarily would have helped the case of trying to detect fraud, like outright blatant fraud like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, and I don't quite have my doctorate yet, so you can just call me Mark. Okay, so Good questions. Please, again, feel free, anyone. If I don't know, just please interrupt me. So one opinion I've encountered both in person and online is that pre-registration is a prison sentence, that it limits sort of your academic or researcher creativity and flexibility to be able to do all things you need to do as a researcher. I don't have a politically correct term for this, but I strongly disagree with that sentiment entirely. And if you want, there's actually a little blog on the Center for Open Science talking about that, because, pardon me, your pre-registration plan is something you're setting up in advance. It's understood that you're not going to foresee every problem you're going to encounter. There could be something about the data collection or the participants, even something like the sample size or characteristics of your data or distributions or assumptional, pardon me, model assumptions haven't been met. You can't foresee all these problems, and it's known you're going to encounter them. But the whole intention behind the pre-registration is you're trying to transparently say, for what I can try and foresee, pardon me, these are all the decisions I'm going to make, and here's the rationale behind why I'm making particular decisions. Some of them might be in line with theory, some of them might be recommended as far as best practices within your subdomain or your substantive field of research. But that's all okay. It's understood that you're not going to perfectly follow those plans. Obviously, the better you follow your predicted plan, like for the design and the analysis, it adds a lot more credibility to your work when you say, here's exactly what I'm going to do. And then we can transparently see you did exactly those things you told me you're going to do, 6 months ago when you did your pre-registration. That does add a lot of credibility because I can transparently see what you said you're going to do and what you actually did. And it's okay to deviate those because you might have reasons, and very good reasons why you might not. Because say in a case you wanted to fit a multiple regression. So you've got one continuous outcome and a couple different predictors or covariates. And when you sit down and you start looking at the data, you realize that maybe some of the distributional assumptions about the residuals are way off. They're like highly skewed or problematically skewed. Like it is robust to some degree of non-normality, but maybe let's say, for instance, for the sake of the argument, it's particularly bad, then sitting down and fitting a multiple linear regression would be an inappropriate way to analyze that data. It would be misleading because maybe there's a curve or linear relationship as well. And so you're going to have to deviate from your analysis plan. And all you're being asked to do is transparently report why. So where, and why did you deviate from that plan? And that's expected. So that's okay. So I don't see why it is a prison sentence locking you in, because yes, it does limit your degrees of researcher degrees of freedom. That's on purpose for the reasons I've said before. And where you do have to deviate, just provide your rationale for those things, and people will understand and be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a wise decision. You were right, or perhaps maybe not right's the right word, but it was sensible for you to deviate in a particular way, because it would have been either unethical or improper to analyze your data or do a different decision another way. So it's not a prison sentence. Anyone who says sort of limits your creativity, to me, is more a statement about their creativity, why they feel so constrained, than it is about the pre-registration itself. Because creativity within constraints is actually can be a really powerful thing. And just because you have to write down what you're going to be doing, I don't see how that stops your creativity and your research process whatsoever. But I want to mention it because someone might tell you that exact sentiment. Okay, so the more complicated question is, what should be included in a research in a pre-registration? So this is a very tricky question with no clear answer, and as a methodologist, the answer is it depends. It always does depend. It's always contingent on what you're doing, because there could be something specific about the research paradigm you're using. So maybe you're actually doing a randomized controlled trial, or maybe you're just doing an observation or natural study. Maybe you are doing how you, pardon me, maybe you're trying to research a hard to find, how to say this, the population which you're interested in is maybe a very rare population. So maybe it's a particular disorder and it's only present, or symptoms of it are present in 3% of the population. How you go about collecting your data might be very different from somebody else. So what you include in your pre-registration plan for how you're going to be collecting or finding these participants might be vastly different from someone in the lab right next door to you at the same institution. So part of what you're going to be looking at for including these things is you can actually find templates out there that'll help you saying, okay, people who are doing similar types of research for in terms of the design or analysis, these are the type of elements they include. And I'm going to have links to some of those later on. We can actually look and say, okay, here's what they did. I will be doing some of these same things, so I'll include those. But my particular research or thing I'm trying to pre-register is a little bit different in kind, so I won't be doing elements 2, 3, and 4, whatever they be. And then maybe you want to provide a justification about why your particular pre-registration doesn't need to worry about whatever that factor is. So part of what you're doing is you're trying to justify why something should be included. And maybe you have to also provide a justification for why something isn't included that most people might think should be. So like I was just trying to say is that on the type of the research you're conducting, if you're doing confirmatory, exploratory, you might be required or suggested to include different things or aspects. It could also depend on the level of transparency you're striving for. So if you're trying to have like the noble goal of being as completely transparent as possible, so all of your research decisions are written down in your pre-registration documents, then you're going to be including maybe a lot more than the other people, but that's okay. So again, it's always about tailoring, we're keeping in mind the goal of your project. So why are you pre-registering this research? Are you trying to increase your transparency, reduce your researcher degrees of freedom so you don't artificially inflate your false positive findings? All these things can be done, through your pre-registration, but keep in mind, these are why you're doing the pre-registration. And so when you make decisions about what should be included, make sure they're in line with that goal. So again, for transparency, let's say you want to collect a sample and you want at least maybe 40 or 50 participants to maybe properly power your analysis, whatever that means. Power is a tricky thing. I'll leave for another workshop. But that's what your goal was, and you ended up collecting 30 or something a little bit under, or even maybe a lot under those things. And you want to make sure that you're transparent, saying, I was intending to collect data of a particular size or in this sort of realm of a particular sample size. So you might not be exactly 40, 50, but you want to be close. And you want to be transparent about why you maybe didn't, or why you chose to stop collecting data. You might not think it's a great idea to include, but it's at least for pre-registration or and you're doing a publication afterwards. If you said you're trying to, if your goal is transparency and you're trying to do that as well as possible, and you said you wanted to collect a particular sample size and you weren't able to do so, I would advise being clear and upfront about why you didn't. So did you run out of time on your project? Like the participant pool closed, I can't get access to any more people, or is it very hard to reach population to sample from, and you did whatever you could and you just can't seem to be generating any more people who are volunteering for the study. So then even though you decided ahead of time, here's what you wanted to get, and you got to realize why you didn't do those things and being transparent about them. Some of those things might get triaged in the manuscript writing process, but at least in your pre-registration, some of these things you can maybe try and foresee and keep those in mind is if transparency was your goal. Sometimes you might not have time to front load on your project. And so what I mean by that is when you're sitting down and doing your pre-registration and you're thinking carefully, you can do that for a long time because there's a lot of questions you can sit down and ask yourself how you might answer them and then try to formally include them in a pre-registration. And there are, especially as grad students and researchers, very real time deadlines. You want to get on your research because the participant pool is opening up for the semester next week, and you want to make sure that this is in place prior to you collecting data. So you just want to do what you can, and do take heart in that the next time you pre-register, it'll be better because you'll work through some of the kinks, and maybe you can sort of foresee some of the problems and do a little bit better next time. Again, keeping in line with your goals. So that's what I was trying to say. So as far as what you should include, continuing along with that thread, is if your goal is to limit the researcher degrees of freedom, then care must be taken at each stage of your whole research process. Everything from planning, running, analyzing, and reporting your data. At every step, there's actually a lot of researcher degrees of freedom that are present to you there, whether you're aware of them or not. And so if you are concerned about, or one of your goals perhaps is to reduce researcher degrees of freedom, I highly recommend checking out this article by Wisher de Velkamp. I am very brutal with names, but I apologize to these authors, in 2016, which actually lists out research degrees of freedom across many stages. And it's actually important enough, I want to hop over to the table and show you from this article. So this is table 1 from their article. And if your goal was, again, to reduce researcher degrees of freedom, they've got a handy little list you can go through and say, these are all the spots at which you've got a lot of flexibility as researchers. So if you're trying to pre-register something, maybe you want to say the C1 during data collection, failing to randomly assign participants to a condition. You would never want to do that, especially if you're trying to do some sort of experimental setup. But if for some reason maybe randomly assigning participants isn't something you can do because it's an observational study, then you maybe want to be clear and say, okay, and make some statement within your pre-registration about the data collection that they are not. Like actually be upfront and say they were not randomly assigned and make it very explicit that's an observational study. And so you can look at all these different types of degrees of freedom across the different stages and put in some sort of statement that addresses how do you limit that or make a decision about that particular researcher degree of freedom. They've also kind of got them cross-referenced between T1 and R6. So R6 down over here is related to, so if you're conducting explorative research or without hypotheses, you also want to be careful when you're reporting results because you don't want to go into something called harking, which is hypothesizing after results are known. Again, think about that as like the called shot in pool where someone just didn't call the shot, hit the ball all around the table, got one in and said, look, that's what I wanted to do the whole time. That would be hard. You're hypothesizing that that's what you're going to find after you saw that you already made the shot. We don't want to be doing that. So this is a nice little table to help you guide. So again, if your goal is to reduce researcher degrees of freedom, the article linked in the slides and this table present in their the research itself would be a great little list to go through if that's your goal. Another thing I didn't mention here is everything that I'm linking to, I believe is all openly available. So no matter where you're at, these are open access journal articles. So you should be able to, regardless of institution or wherever you're at, have access to all of these. And if you also want to, there's also this nice little guide. So I do want to let you know that this link right here will actually go to download a PDF from the osf.io. So right from their files, they're one of the repositories. And they've actually got a guide where back when the article was written, they called them pre-analysis plans, but it's a pre-registration plan. It doesn't really matter what you call it. That's what it's going to get after. And they've actually got like a little checklist as you're going through down. Pardon me, as you scroll down through the document, you can even print this off and check it as you're completing your registration to make sure you've included all these different aspects that should be in, according to them, should be included in the pre-registration. And if there's something there that you feel shouldn't be in your pre-registration, you can always put a statement about why it's not included to, again, increase the transparency and ultimately credibility of your work. Okay. One other thing that is commonly overlooked as part of the pre-registration process is how to avoid what's called questionable measurement practices. This is by Jessica Flake and Eiko Fried. Again, a nice link to their open source article where they listed a series of 6 questions which were developed to promote transparent reporting of measurement practices. So in my experience as a statistical consultant here at York University, I've got a lot of people coming in and they administered a questionnaire of some sort to their subjects and they want help analyzing their data. And to me, I've got a lot of questions about there. So one of the things some of these questions are some of the ones that actually go through with clients. So following these 6, and again, if you want more about these questions, please go to the article. They actually have elaborations on each one of these things and sub-questions to help you out. So you want to ask, what is your construct? So what is it you're after? Are you trying to get some sort of measure or proxy of depression? Then that should be in your pre-registration, that your construct of what you're trying to measure is depression. Why and how did you select your particular measure? Again, saying someone else in the field or a big name in the field has used this measure or developed it, that's okay, but maybe a stronger argument would be that people who are measuring these things, it seems to be typically robust and the results from it are pretty predictive, so it's actually pretty accurate to reality. What measure did you use to operationalize this construct? So again, if you are measuring depression, and maybe there is a particular depression inventory that you're using, that's how you're operationalizing it. So you're saying, I'm going to be using this particular questionnaire. You might want to mention or make explicit how the questionnaire scores. So higher scores on here indicate higher or a larger presence of symptoms or whatever it is. So that's how you're operationalizing it. How did you quantify the measure? Is it a sum score? So the people answer 18 questions, yes or no, and you just counted up all the yeses and that is their score. So that's how you quantify or put a number to the measurement of the construct you're interested in. An important one that is very often missed in my experience is, did you actually modify the scale? So did you omit problematic items? Did you add an item? Did you change the wording on something? Were they translated into a different language? All these things are very, very important, because if you're changing the scale, how do you know that those changes you made don't actually make it so you're measuring something else than what you intended? Like the validity of the scale. Like, are you actually still measuring the thing you set out to do? So if you do modify the scale, just be very upfront and clear about how and why you did those things. So how did you change it? And then why did you make those changes? Was it you collected data and you looked at it and it's not in line with how other samples have appeared in other researcher output? Whatever the reasons are, at least you can be transparent and report for why you modified the scale or omitted a particular item in your quantifying of your measure. Now the question is, did you create the measure on the fly? So are you developing your own scale? Perfectly fine. Developing my own scale scares me, because there's a lot of work that goes into those things and testing those and pilot testing those. But if you are creating your own, maybe you want to make it clear that you are pilot testing your own measure for whatever reason. And another argument that these two authors make is, if you're doing so, you should also supply a rationale for why didn't you use a pre-existing measure. So if you're looking at depression, why did you create your own item scale when there is quite a large number of them out there already that are actually pretty well developed and widely used, at least understood in your field? Why did you not do those, and why did you pick your own? That's actually a really important question, because when I think about questionable measurement practices, I'm like, okay, so what are you doing here? Why did you create your own question? How do you know you're still measuring the same thing that these other measures are doing? So when everybody talks about depression, you might be talking about something slightly different or correlated, because it's similar in how the questions are phrased, but you could be getting at different substantive content. Things to think about. So again, check that out. That they have got a preprint, and I think it just made it into publication this last year. It's pretty good article. Good. It gets me thinking quite a bit. So if something's getting you thinking about something, as far as research goes, usually that's a good sign. Go with it. So this is the point in the workshop where we're actually going to try and complete a pre-registration. So I do want to have a little note here. There is no single way to do this. There isn't like the gold standard of here's how you pre-register your research always. It always just depends. And I'm just showing you my preferred method, and one, if asked, I would also recommend it to other people, other researchers. So as I fumble around doing this, there's going to be a lot of pointing and clicking, and not as much of following the slides. But I'm going to be using my ORCID ID and accessing the OSF, and I'm going to walk through creating a repository and go through all these steps. So if anyone have any questions about the sort of content we've got here before we diverge and go into the hands-on practice. Okay, a lot of silence. So that means I either explained everything really, really well, or we might have some shy participants. And I'm probably going to go with the shy participants. Anyways, again.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, could I interrupt for a question? Thanks. So I've been hearing that one major criticism of pre-registration is that it's relatively slow and might not necessarily match what academia or future jobs might be currently rewarding or looking for. So for example, a lot of the posts or a lot of things that people are looking for are number of publications or the quality of the journals that people are publishing in, and maybe not rewarding pre-registration and open science as much. So I was wondering, for early career scientists like PhD students, do you think that the benefits of engaging in pre-registration are actually outweighing some of the slowness that comes with the process?
Yeah, excellent question. Actually, I'm glad you asked, because I didn't think to include a statement like that anywhere. So yes, without question, you will be slower. So someone who is taking the time to plan out the research, pardon me, that's not fair to say, to fill out a pre-registration plan and your analysis, you are going to be a little bit slower than the person who's not doing those things, because they have got their plan in place, and then they're off to the races doing the data collection, and it's going to be hard to match the output or the number of publications that they're getting, because they aren't doing all of this extra steps and work. So they are taking care to plan their studies. I'm not trying to say that they're careless or flippant about any of their design decisions. I'm just saying if I'm trying to have credibility to my work and make sure I'm building a solid foundation and having as big of a most impactful contribution to the literature as I can, I don't want to be doing these things. But the very real fact is there are incentive structures against stopping in anything that slows down your research output, including pre-registration. I've made the personal choice of doing what I can to fill these things out. And I will say that there is light in the end of the tunnel. I don't know how long the tunnel is, to use the analogy, but things like hiring practices, like in committees, I was on a tenure promotion committee, and some of these subjects that came up in the hiring, or pardon me, the advancing to tenure, one of the particular faculty members was looking at open science things. So are they doing openly available data? Do they have pre-regs? Like, they aren't going into all the nitty-gritty details, but the fact that they're part of the conversations in hiring processes, and some people are actually looking for some company, some institutions might also actually require you to submit some sort of statement saying where you stand on open science, and they like seeing these positive things, because it is a very real movement now that's gained a lot of traction, where a lot of early career researchers are doing their best to do all these things and trying to change how the system currently is. But obviously there's a lot of inertia in the publication machine idea of how institutions, where they're just trying to be like, let's just get papers out there and produce and get notoriety and all the things that go with those. And you are, in some real sense, you could be not, yeah, you might even say setting yourself back a little bit in terms of time, because, but then the other flip side of that coin or argument is all you're really doing is front loading the work. What I mean by that is you have to stop and think and make these analysis decisions and design decisions no matter what. So if you're conducting research, everybody's making these decisions. What you are doing by pre-registering is you're saying, I'm taking all this work and these analysis decisions that I might have to make later, and I'm doing my best to make them now at the front of my research. So it might take longer, but it might not. It's not guaranteed, because you have to make these decisions anyways. And if you're documenting these things down, the time spent to fill out the pre-registration might be the only real additional time that you're adding to your process. That makes sense.
Yes, it does. That's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, thank you all for the questions. Okay, so we're going to walk through a demonstration of a pre-registration. So again, please be kind. So I'm going to be fumbling through some of these things, because this is where part of the process goes. It's still a learning experience for myself as well. So what I'm going to be doing, just outline the steps, and I'll actually walk through them, is I'm going to be logging into OSF and creating a project, and I'm going to show you all these in advance. And I'm going to go through, I'll discuss and showcase a lot of different templates you can use and how to do those. And if you're actually curious, there's a great little blog in the help section for OSF that actually walks through this exact process, I think more or less, that I'm doing, about creating a repository on OSF, creating a creating a pre-registration plan to go along with the project, and uploading files that might supplement that pre-registration plan. And they've also got a lot of screenshots showing you all the buttons that you need to be clicking as you're going. So in case you don't want to sit and go watch this recording again, I highly recommend walking through those steps. So I'm just going to hop over to OSF now. We'll see if I'm still logged in. Okay, so right now I'm already logged in. So if you weren't and you were asked to create a OSF, what I recommend is going to ORCID again, creating your ORCID ID. And then I use that to sign in here. That way everything's sort of all linked together for myself. So you can see that here, Christopher Adkins, this is my dashboard. So when I log into OSF, if you haven't done this before, there's my dashboard. And they've got a list of some of the titles that I've been working on, some another biology students workshop I was doing, a variety of other things. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to pretend that I am trying to pre-register some research that I've planned out. So when you go to sit down and actually do the pre-registration, ideally you've made your decisions in advance. So you might start going through the process using one of these templates as a guide, and realize there's a question there you hadn't thought about. The nice thing is it'll save it as a draft. You can stop, think about it, or go maybe check some other resources, make your decisions, and come back and finish filling it out. You don't have to have it all ready in advance, then come here and do it all in one shot. You can make it like a bit of a work in process until you are ready to release it. So the first step I'm going to do is creating a new project. And if you ever have to do workshops and things on the fly, it is always helpful to have a little notepad with all the things you want to be doing. So what I'm going to be doing is kind of mimicking a pre-registration I did for this secondary data analysis plan for the Psychological Science Accelerator. And it's going to be titled A Mixed Effects Approach to Understanding Trait Ratings of Faces Across World Regions. Without getting the project too much, they've got this globally distributed network of labs, which you can be a part of to do sort of like mass scale data collection for particular research questions. When you're creating a new project and you're storing this information, especially if you are eventually posting data to be saved on here, be mindful of the storage location because you might have ethical obligations to make sure. So if I am collecting data in here, part of my ethics agreement for my research within your institution might require it to be hosted at a Canadian storage location, which is really weird to think about, but it's true. So in my case, if you're not sure, maybe default to one of the storage locations that you in the country you're in or close by to. So I'm going to be doing Canada. And you can also go click more and enter a little description of your project. And I'm going to put my little description here. So it's a second data analysis. We'll say for the Psychological Science Accelerator's Social Faces project. So that makes a bit of a reference for the project supposed to be going on to. And if you know to begin with, if you are just creating a project on OSF and you've used them before, you can create little templates. If you've got a particular research paradigm you do or design regularly, you can use one of these templates instead of going through all the work of creating the structure again. You can use those, but for this case, we won't. So I've got my project title, storage location, and maybe a bit of a description all set up. I think you can change the title and description later, but storage location might be set. So I'm going to go ahead and create it. It says successful. I can keep working on my dashboard, or I'm going to go to my project. Clearly, that's what I'm going to be doing. And so this is what a project on OSF sort of looks like if you haven't been here before. You can still see my log information, some of the other navigation panes at the top. Any contributors you can add over here, and these are nice because they've got your little profiles. It shows you things like the data was created when I last updated it. My description, it carries over here. Oh, I guess I can edit it just by clicking on it. Handy. If you have licenses that you want around here, there are some pre-made licenses. Like you can do CC0 is like public domain. Anyone can use this or cite this, whatever you want. Or if you're not sure, you can use CC BY, so by attribution. So people want to reference to pre-registration as for whatever reason, you can put one of these licenses on there. They aren't required, but if you're curious, you can do that. A bit more about the navigation here. You can create a little wiki. Think of it like as a README or a larger description of maybe some of the process. And then down over here is the list of your files. Right now it's empty. So at this storage location in Montreal, Canada, for my project where stored, there's no currently, there are not any current files listed here. So this right here is a navigation pane that tells me I'm currently inside of this project called A Mixed Effects Approach to under ... whatever the name is. And so as you navigate around within your project, that might change a little bit, but at the project level, these are some of the things you can mess around with. And so what I'm going to be doing is for my project, I want to create a pre-registration plan. So I'm going to go to registrations. And it currently says for this project, I have no completed registrations and I have no current drafts. So whatever way I do it, I can just click new registration because that's what I'm wanting to be doing. And these are handy little templates you can use. So for today, I've already looked through them and made a decision about which one I think is appropriate for the research or the little demonstration I'm doing for you. And that'll be this top one. And I think in the slides, there is a link to these templates. So they've actually got the documents and the questions listed on OSF. So if you just want to browse through the types of questions that are within all of these templates, they're all listed as separate files. You can simply open them up, take a look through them to maybe get a sense for which one you're going to be doing. And I'm going to go with this sort of standard fare one. I'm going to create my draft. So the nice thing is for my project, it carries in my title, my description for me. If I've got contributors in my project, it carries them in here. So this is like the metadata section. So there's a little bit about, what is the product, who's collecting it, or sort of the upper level data information about your pre-registration, not the nitty-gritty details yet. So if you had institutional affiliations, they'd all be listed here. Or if you had a license set for the overall project, that would carry over here. And you can also set up your subjects here to help make this pre-registration findable. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to be looking in the social and behavioral sciences. Maybe I'm going to be doing something with psychology. And I can't remember what I picked last time. Maybe we're looking at something like social psychology. So it's looking at the project originally is looking at different ratings of traits present in faces that they're being rating on. So we'll put in the social psychology. And if you've got any other tags, this is a handy place to put them. So if there's a particular research paradigm or construct you're using in your study, you can add these little tags to make it a little bit more findable or easy to discover, because someone can go into OSF, search to pre-registrations for people studying in a particular subdomain or a particular topic, and you can put these in here so that other researchers can find your work and either use it to assess something on your own or use that as a template and maybe as an example for how they might want to do theirs. So if you've got tags, they're not required, but you can put them in there. And so nice thing about OSF is it also auto saves this for me. So as I'm completing it, if you lose anything, like if your browser goes down or Wi-Fi goes down, it's frequently doing this nice auto save feature. So I went to the study information and noticed right here that the metadata actually turned red because I'm missing something like a required field. And it tells me that my license cannot be blank. So I am going to do this one. So, well, no, just do regular CC by 4. So if you're not familiar with these Creative Commons licenses, look them up and look into them before you just make a decision. I'm just going with the CC by attribution, share alike. So people are totally welcome to take the work, adjust it or amend it and share it or distribute it, as long as they attribute me as a source for those things. Because again, when we think about publications, we want our names to things because that's just the currency of the realm we're in. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one. Now, if that means I've completed all the required data. There may be more things you want to do there, but it's required. So as far as my study goes, I have to carefully outline my hypotheses. And one nice thing here is you can click on this to show little examples. If you're not sure how to maybe phrase that, they've got little examples for what you might want to be doing. And so I'm going to copy a hypothesis from a pre-registration I've already completed, saying there will be differences in the average trait ratings across world regions as a function of stimulus ethnicity, stimulus sex, and rater sex. And I'm saying there's like non-directional differences. So this is one of the parts that I'm cringing at looking at now a year later. It's like that is very, very vague for hypotheses. One, I'm not in the facial trait recognition like subdomain of research. I'm not familiar with a lot of theory behind these things. So I didn't have any reason to believe there will be effects in a certain particular direction or maybe in some world regions relative to other world regions. But if I was, I'd probably have a lot more care and I'd be a lot more specific about what my hypotheses are. So again, think about those cold shots is if you are in the confirmatory testing or you're confirming your, if you're in the confirmatory analysis sort of realm for your research, then you want to make sure that you are making as precise and specific hypothesis that you think you're warranted to make. Because again, if you find evidence of those things, it's like that cold shot. You were very clear, this is the narrow range of what I'm expecting to find. And look, I found exactly that thing. And that adds a lot of credibility to your work. But at least here I'm being very clear. Non-directional means I don't know which way it's going to be going. I'm talking a little bit about my measurements. I'm saying the average trade ratings. So I'm going to go into the design. Try to. So that's got a check mark because I've completed that. So this is where you would have stopped and thought carefully about your research design. For the pre-registration that I'm trying to replicate here this was data that already exists. So it was already collected, but I didn't have access to it yet. So in their design, it was experimental because they had 13 different conditions or different emotional traits there. Every participant was asked, so there's a different condition that could be randomly assigned to, and then we collected information in outcome measures. So it was experimental. I don't believe there's any blinding in the study. So again, these are both required because they are very, very important things. And if there's any other additional blinding that you might have done for the study, you can put that in here. As far as your study design, there's another required field. Here's the example. So there's a between subject design and whether you used one factor. And for this particular study that we did for the analysis, what I'm going to do is talk about this. So my design was a mixed effects design. probably put that in there. So again, if someone wasn't familiar with it, that's looking at between person and within person effects, kind of all within the same model. And it was a lovely, complicated 4x2x2x11 multi-level mixed effects model. So it was a lovely thing to sort through. But just tell someone, so someone's reading through my pre-registration. This is essentially how I'm proposing to analyze my data based on the design. So this is the design for how participants are allocated. And you can also additionally upload additional files for you here. And one other thing I'm going to be doing, hopping back to my slides, is that one right there. So I'll get to this in a moment. So there's this nice little free resource online called Eco Modeler, where when you're including your pre-registration plans or anything, you might want to include like a flow chart to maybe diagram how the data collection process proceeds. Maybe you've got a type of a decision tree. So you're fitting a particular model and there are 4 or 5 assumptions of those models. What happens when one of those is violated? You make decisions in advance, because if you know you're fitting a multiple linear regression, you've got homogeneity of variance problems, you've got normality of the residuals you're assuming there aren't any outliers, you're assuming that the effect is overall linear between your predictors and your outcome variable. And what if those aren't? So if you had planned a particular analysis, you can actually set up a decision tree that says, I'm going to be fitting a model, and when or if a problem occurs that you might be able to foresee, like an assumption model being violated, what are you going to do in advance? So you can actually make a decision tree. So maybe you want to a model. Again, this is really rough, forgive me. When you've got this selected, it's over here, and you can add additional notes about what you mean. Maybe it's a multiple linear regression that you're going to be doing. And what if a particular assumption is violated? So let's get normality residuals. And you can click on this, drag the arrow down to that point. Just try it again, go for real this time. It's highlighted, so there. So fit the model, normality of residuals. You can actually enter a description. So what's the question that's sort of when you fit the model, when you go down to this thing? So maybe this should actually be residuals are not normally distributed, but I'll say normal because I don't want to type it all. And I'll try to spell it correctly. So I'm going to fit my model. If the model's residuals are not normal, maybe there is a common transformation, or maybe you want to fit a robust multiple linear regression. So I'm not going to go into what those are here, but that might be an option. So this is just a way of saying you can take this free online tool called Eco Modeler. It's actually, I found out about it on the OSF and was preparing for this. I see chat question here. I'm not sure, sorry, how long ago you wrote this question. So the question reads, if you mentioned the study, but is there a way to see all these different components to pre-registration without actually starting the pre-registration on ORCID? So the pre-registration that I'm listing is going to be on OSF specifically. And yes, so all those different templates or components you might want to include. I think somewhere in the next couple of slides, I've got a link. Actually, let's go back up to those. Right over here. So right here, yeah. So like this link right here to the OSF is if you're looking at the templates of all these different components you might want to put in. So the metadata, the study design, all these little fields I'm filling out for my draft pre-registration right now. You can actually download all those questions as like a Word doc or a Google Doc. So if you actually, well, I'll show you. I'll click on that. It'll take me to OSF. These are the templates of the OSF registration forms. I'm currently doing this OSF pre-registration. And you can download as a Google Doc, this one, R Markdown file, a different R Markdown file. And so you can just take those things and fill it out as you're going. So you can have those available to look at. You're welcome. All right, really tabs open, back to Eco Modeler. So again, this is just a proof of concept that you can do those things. If you got a particular decision tree, so depending on data analytic conditions, maybe there's certain types of models or things you're going to do to address problems. So maybe you've got missing data, so I'm using add a component down over here, drag a new arrow over to this one, data, and then you might decide if you're going to be doing something like multiple, I cannot see that, multiple imputation, maybe you're doing listwise deletion. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty about how those, because dealing with missing data is a very messy, complicated thing. But again, the nice thing here is you can just drag and drop all these things. You can add new little components, add notes to them, put a little, maybe your question here about what you're doing, and then this is the answer. So if the residual is not normal, you go down here and do all of this. And then maybe once you've made all these different adjustments, you are going to refit the model. And these all line back up over here. So you can do these sort of like flow charts for your data analysis decisions. For the design of your study, maybe you want to illustrate the flow. So when a participant comes into your lab, if you can get in person, and there's a certain process, like they start off by being providing informed consent, then they go over here and then they're randomly just assigned to a particular condition. They complete the task and then they leave. You can illustrate whatever you want, and you can export this as an image by hitting the save, and it'll pop up a dialog saying where you want to save it, and you can upload the picture of this model onto OSF to illustrate sort of some of your design or analytic decisions. You can also save this as a particular file format for this model, and you can upload that. That way someone can actually download that model, load it up into the eco modeler here, and then have full access to all the notes to look into more detail. So you can also edit it as well later. So not required, might be handy, especially if you're trying to show somebody what's happening or make sure you're addressing a lot of different contingencies that might be possible. This eco model is a nice free tool, which I learned about literally 2 days ago, and I think it's pretty neat. Closing some of these ones. I just closed my OSF thing, so I'm going to go back over to that. Okay, so I accidentally closed my pre-registration. So let's demonstrate how OSF stops you from doing silly things like that. So I've created a project. Here it exists. I can actually click on it. I'm back in the project. Nothing's changed because I haven't added anything. I go back up to my registrations tab. There is now a draft available because it saved all the stuff I was working on, so I can review it or just jump right in and edit it. I'm going to do that. And so I'm not going to go through all the rest of these things, but I will go through the tabs for them. So we've already covered metadata, study information. I was talking about the design plan. So we're talking about things like our randomization, blinding. Sorry for the fast scrolling, if that's hard for people to see. And as far as the design or study, if you actually want to create like a flow chart, you can again create those as an image or as a .eco file or the file for the eco modeler. And you can upload those here as part of your pre-registration planning, saying here's exactly how I'm going to do all those things. So you can write them all up. And sometimes it's hard to write up like a decision tree like that. So maybe you actually want to create one. You can put it all in here. So this is a little bit more work maybe than normal, but these are all possibilities, and those things aren't required. The bare minimum, because if you look here, I just have to fill out my study design. You don't have to upload additional materials. If you have them and they're helpful and there's something you want to put in there to either increase transparency, reduce your researcher degrees of freedom, or any of these other goals, feel free to make this as complete as you want, but all that's officially required is some statement here. Sampling plan, so if the data is existing, then you want to specify was your registration prior to data creation, so the data don't exist, you didn't see anybody yet, or was it prior to any human observation of the data, so it's collected but no one's opened the file or accessed to the data yet. So again, this is a little bit on the honor system. So again, if someone's trying to do fraud, that's not really what this whole pre-registration process is attempting to mitigate. We're just trying to make sure that everybody's as honest as possible. And you're going to try and be as transparent as possible. So if you want to disclose that your registration was prior to an analysis of the data, so you've actually looked at the data but you haven't analyzed it yet, maybe make that clear, because sometimes it's hard to summarize if you're looking through a long table how the results might pan out just looking at that sort of just line by line from your CSV files or whatever it's stored as. But you want to be clear, have you actually peeked or opened the file and take a look around those things? Because I might read this afterwards and be like, doesn't mean just because you didn't analyze the data doesn't mean you didn't poke around and look and see some of these really extreme scores, and you change some of your registration plans or pre-registration plans based on what you've seen in the data. That's probably not the greatest plan. You want to be like, as blind as possible to remove all these biases that as psychologists, we should hopefully be very aware that we all have. And part of the pre-registration idea is we've got these known biases, let's do something and put part of our workflow to sort of counteract those. Optional, so if you have existing data, you want to explain why it's there, talk a little bit more about your data collection procedures. Again, additional files, you can do flow charts, you can make another little Word document that writes it up more fully or more descriptively. So instead of cramming it all in here, you can upload that file. It's really nice because once you upload files here, it'll also automatically upload them and they'll be available on your OSF project. And then you've got things like your sample size. So I want to make sure I have time for a couple more questions. I didn't realize it's going to go quite this long. But they'll be going over something about like your variables. If you've got manipulated variables, so if you're doing an intervention, then you might want to be putting those things in there. If you've got your particular measured variables or outcomes that you're interested in, make sure you're explicitly putting those. Different indices, all these things you found around part of your analysis plan. So this would be pretty more clearly state exactly which statistical model or test you might be doing. You might want another bit of a file here. Pardon me. One other thing that for the pre-registration I'm sort of replicating, what was one of the requirements of the data analysis challenge is we had to, using R or some other similar scripting language, actually write up a analysis script. So we were given like a simulated version of the data sets. We didn't know what the actual data looked like. We knew all the names of the variables. We had some sense of whether the continuous measures or things like that. We actually had to write an R script that would import that data and I could run and fit the particular models that we were interested in to explore our hypotheses. And so one thing you can do here is you can write out the model. And if you are comfortable with R, or if you have SPSS and you're comfortable writing syntax, you can supply an actual R syntax file that says, here is exactly how I'm going to analyze the data. So you can describe it, and then you can show, and you're saying, I'm promising that when I've got my data, I'm going to run the script. And when you go to run it later, if you run into problems, that's where you say, here's why I deviated from my planned script, and we go ahead and do those. So I'm actually just going to show that. So let's see. Sorry, I'll finish this and get it myself. They've also got a spot for other, so if you have any other information you want to include here, you can go ahead and include it at the other, and then they give you a chance to review it, and that's just a summary of all the information, the different subjects, if you had tags. So everything from all these different subsections or components of your pre-registration plan will be available all the way down here. And once you've got these all completed and you're done, this won't be blocked out anymore. You'll be able to register it. And once you register it, that's when you're creating this timestamp document that says, as of the second that I clicked this button, all of these files that I submitted onto here as part of my pre-registration plan, all this information in there are now locked. I cannot edit that document anymore. And that's the whole point we want. So we don't want people to be able to go back and change things saying, oh, look, I did predict this in advance. It's locked. And that means you're all set to go. So once you've done that and you've got this registered, when you go back to your OSF project and you look at your pre-registration tab, you'll have a completed pre-registration plan associated with that. So again, nice thing is this saves as drafts and you can put as much or as little information as you want, but obviously more sort of better, especially if you're making these decisions anyways. And when you're all said and done, you can just leave and come back. Like I accidentally closed this tab, it saved all my information as a draft. I can come back in here and you can play around with it until you're comfortable that all the decisions or thought that you've put into your product in advance anyways are now documented within a pre-registration plan. And once you've got it all set and you're ready to go, you can hit register. If you have collaborators on this product, so maybe your supervisor or other lab mates are all part of this project, and you go to pre-register, it will automatically notify the other people saying, okay, there's a pre-registration about to be submitted, and give them an option to review it. I think 24 or 48 hours, they have a chance to sort of go on and look at it and either just approve it, or by default, it'll get approved at their time. So that way, when you hit register, other people who are working on the same project with you aren't stuck with what you've pre-registered. They all have a chance to do those, and will automatically notify them. So there's a lot of nice built-in features for using OSF, which is why I personally prefer it. But there are other registries, there are other ways of doing preprints. This is just one way to serve some of the goals that we've talked about here today. Okay, a couple tips. I jumped ahead and talked about this eco modeler. So again, you can export the image or the model file and you can upload that. Sometimes you might want to include a decision tree about when you encounter certain problematic analytic conditions, like violated model assumptions. And if you're familiar with the variables, you can actually upload a script file. And here's actually a link to the pre-registration script that I put in from my project. So preregscript.r, super original name. Don't judge me too much. So my co-authors were listed, and the project we're working on required a statement that said we're committing to analyzing this confirmatory segment. And I loaded the libraries that were needed, This is the code for cleaning up the data to make it analysis ready. I'm not going to go over this ARCO. This isn't an R workshop, but I stipulated all the formulas I was doing. And down at the bottom, it goes through, it creates subsets of all my data and fits the appropriate levels of models so that I've got them. So once I get the data, we would run this the way we promised to run it for confirmatory analysis, and we can go through and analyze all the results. But again, you can make this as complicated, and this is just an optional piece. So if you are familiar with the scripting language, I recommend maybe putting one of these things down there, because it sort of helps you lock in some of those design decisions. And when you eventually go to reporting these things, it's recommended when you're reporting pre-registered research that you also include a link to the original pre-registration plan that you've got. So again, this is a document locked in time, and you actually give a link, because that'll be always stable and won't be moving or changing location. So when you write up your final description on your manuscript, you can have a link in there somewhere to the original pre-registration plan, so anyone who's curious can actually go back and check. And it's transparently saying, here's what I plan to do. And then that was linked from the document of when you actually did those things. That doesn't make any sense there, but report is the results of all pre-specified tests. If you said you're testing something, report on it. Don't just admit it, and if it's significant or not what you wanted to find or not, always report them. Clearly label any unplanned analyses. So it's okay to explore and deviate from your plan. Just be clear when, here's my pre-registered plan, what I predicted, and here's something else neat I saw in the data I want to follow up on or explore. Just making it explicit when you transition between those. And I'm not going to go over this too much, but also recommends including a transparent change document, which outlines from your pre-registration plan when you deviated, why did you do all those things, and you can find examples of those online. And here's another helpful article talking about when you're reporting these. So a couple closing remarks here. There's a great article by Dana Lockins I like, talking about the value of pre-registration and how it all depends on your philosophy of science. Another really good read if you're interested in about to embark on a pre-registration. Where in there he's saying every research practice comes with costs and benefits, and it's useful to evaluate whether and when it is worth pre-registering your study. So just because someone told you should probably do it, not a very strong argument. The fact that you want to increase the transparency of your work, reduce researcher degrees of freedom, to also reduce the false positive possible findings in your research, all very good reasons for maybe embarking on a pre-registration process. But about what's your goal for this and why you're doing it. And there's also the concern that if you use a tool like pre-registration and it's detached from your philosophy of science or why you're doing this research to begin with, it risks becoming a heuristic where everybody's doing a pre-registration because that's just what is expected or what grad students are taught. Researchers should not choose that just because it's like that new norm. They should pre-register because they can justify it based on their philosophy of science, how pre-registration supports your goals. So if you are in the hypothesis testing framework and you're doing confirmatory testing, then having transparent, making transparent all of your researcher degrees of freedom and decisions that you've made, predicting in advance what you're hoping to find or making predictions, all these things are sort of things that fall along the statistical error, I think, philosophy of science, where you're trying to keep your type 1 error rates low and your type 2 error rates low, or finding that balance between the two. So while you're testing these things. Okay, that was a really close to an hour and a half. Thank you all for listening to me today. And what are your questions? I have a bit of extra time if you guys are interested as well.